All right. So welcome to Scientist to Go. My name is Eowyn and I use pronouns she and her. And today we have a lovely scientist that's going to be speaking with us. The first half, she'll be talking about her research background in archaeology, and then she is going to be talking also about how her work has changed and what she is doing now with 4-H. And then we are going to transition into our question and answer portion. So you guys will get a chance to ask any questions that you may have. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Erin.
All right. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Get it up here. Okay. And Eowyn, if you could just monitor the chat box in case anything does come up while I'm talking, because I won't be able to watch that.
Absolutely. I'll take care of that chat for you.
All right. Thank you. All right. So like Eowyn said, my name is Erin McDonald, and I work for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, specifically working with 4-H, and I oversee all of the 4-H programs in York County. So I'm down in Springvale. And if I don't know if any of you are involved in 4-H, but if you are, you should tell your friends all about it and see if they're interested in getting involved as well. It's a great program for kids. Okay, so my talk is about archaeology, the science of archaeology, and this is what I did before I started working for 4-H. Okay. Oops, let's see. All right, so first, let's just get started here. What is archaeology? It is not the study of dinosaurs. Archaeologists do not dig up dinosaurs, okay? Archaeology is the study of ancient people through the cultural material that they left behind. And we can figure out what archaeology means based on the word here. So arche, this first part of the word here, can you see my mouse when I move it? Okay, good. So arche, that means ancient, and ology means to study. So to study the ancient. We study ancient people, ancient cultures. And specifically, we look at material culture or cultural material. It's the same thing. Those are the objects. You may have heard the term artifact before. So objects or artifacts, and the structures or buildings that were made by human hands. Okay, so anything that was made by humans is considered material culture. And so we have a picture here. This is me excavating. I am in a pit that someone dug out thousands of years ago, and I was excavating it out. So that's an example of like a structure. And then on the other side, we have some arrowheads here that were chipped at or knapped by people a very long time ago and used as arrowheads or other types of projectiles. And those are artifacts. So they're the smaller things. It's not going to let me use my arrow keys. Okay. So both the objects and structures that people make are called material culture. So just some more examples then of what archaeologists might be studying. So we've got some big stuff here, like this is Stonehenge, really big stones. You can't move this. This is a structure. And so in some places we find structures that were left behind. We don't always find things like that. But there are some very famous ones like Stonehenge or the pyramids in Egypt. More often we find these small objects that people made that are artifacts. So we've got here a rusty nail. So this could have been from a house from like the 1800s. If any of you live in an old farmhouse, it's possible that you have some rusty nails that are quite old in your yard somewhere in your garden. You may even have some broken glass bottles from quite a long time ago, and plates and cups and things like that. Those are all artifacts. We also have things like arrowheads, like I showed before, pieces of pottery from a very long time ago, and even bones. So like if you think about if you have turkey for dinner, maybe next week if you're celebrating Thanksgiving, you're not eating the bones, those get thrown out, and those often get left behind, and archaeologists can find them in the future. And so any bones that we find are often from meals that people ate. And sometimes we do find bodies. So look around your classroom, take a second, look around your classroom. Do you see any material culture? Do you see anything that would fall under the category of material culture? Something made by human hands. You don't have to answer, just look for a minute. Look around, okay? All right. Now think of something, like find something, one thing in particular that you think, okay, I think that's material culture. Like, no, there's nothing here. There's no pottery. There are no arrowheads. Like I said, everything that humans have made with their hands is an artifact, is material culture. So everything that is in your room that you are in, the computer that you're using, the chair that you're sitting on, the clothes that you're wearing, that's all material culture. And 1,000 years from now, archaeologists are going to be looking at this. They're going to be excavating your school and finding all of this material and learning about how we taught students and how children learned in the past, which is our present. And I want to go back real quick to the title of my talk. It's talking trash. What does that mean? Why am I talking about trash? I haven't mentioned trash at all. Material culture, okay, it's the stuff that people made, but the stuff that people leave behind when they pick up and move, they leave their trash behind. They don't leave behind the important things. So a lot of times what archaeologists are finding is the material that was left behind. It's like, okay, we're moving, we're not staying here anymore. So anything that we don't want, that's not important, it's going to be left behind. And so that's, when we move, there's always some trash that, gets thrown in the dumpster. It's like, okay, we don't need another, pile of papers and all that, throw that away. But yes, I want grandma's pearl necklace. Like that's important. So we're going to hold on to that and bring that with us. And so that's where talking trash comes from. A lot of material culture that archaeologists look at is ancient garbage. It's very old garbage. Though there are instances where we find some of the very nice stuff as well, especially if there are nice burials, like if you're familiar with any of the tombs in Egypt, those often have lots of very important material in them, and gold and jewels. And that's not common around the world where in different places where archaeologists work. It's often the stuff that's not quite that exciting, but is still very important. Okay, so we understand now what it is that what archaeologists study. They study people from the past, long time ago, based on the materials that they have around that they used and made. Okay, well, how do we do that? You have to dig. All right, so excavation is one of the ways that archaeologists gather data or find objects and structures that are from the past. And so I have a couple of pictures here of different excavations that I worked on. One is in a cornfield. That was not very much fun. Pulling our gear through the cornfield, like halfway through the cornfield every day was not fun, especially in the middle of the summer. And corn leaves are really spiky and like sharp and have lots of little hairs on them. So it's not always fun. But I have all these little red arrows here pointing to some of the important tools that we use. So we have this wooden thing here that I'm standing at. This is a screen. So we dump dirt in and then shake it and get all the big clumps of dirt out. And what will be left are some of the smaller artifacts. In my hand here, you can't see it very well, is a trowel. That's a very important tool that archaeologists use. It's like a little shovel. We've got buckets and big shovels, tape measure. Taking measurements is really important. I'm holding here in this picture a book of different soil colors. This is another piece of data that we collect. We actually talk about the soil and what type of soil it is that we're digging through. And then, of course, the most important tool that archaeologists use is paperwork. Filling out paperwork, keeping all of that data recorded. That's if you don't record any of it, you can't study any of it. Right. So this is excavation, and this is often what people think of when they think of archaeologists, Indiana Jones and going out there and digging big holes and finding amazing treasures, okay? And here's a couple of examples of what some excavations might look like. The big picture here, this is out in Arizona, and you can see there's a lot of ground exposed here. We've cleared trees and everything. There's a lot of different holes. We're working in a really big space. And then the smaller picture here, this is in Ireland, and it's actually a pretty small hole that we're digging in. And so the type of hole that you dig, types of excavations that you do, it's different depending on the questions that you're asking and maybe the type of construction that might be going on. And if it's a really big construction project, before they do the construction, you need to excavate and get any of important material out of the ground. But sometimes it's just a smaller excavation as well. But excavation isn't always the best option. Excavation isn't always the way that you get data. It's one way. There are lots of other things that you can do to learn about the past or use information that people have already gathered from their excavation. So like if I did a bunch of excavating and I recorded everything, the types of soil that was in, that all the artifacts were in, and the type of landscape that we were in, that data, even if I don't use it to study the artifacts that I found, that data can be studied by someone else to add to our knowledge of the past. So you can use maps and things like GIS and GPS. You can look at soil and the things that the types of metals or other compounds that get left in the soil when people have been living in a certain place. You can look at bones, all sorts of different things. I looked at pollen. I hope all of you know what pollen is. I hope not too many of you suffer from allergies caused by pollen. But so I looked at pollen. This is a picture here of from a microscope. The things that are circled are little pollen grains. Okay, this is microscopic pollen grains. And here I am at my microscope and my loyal dog helping me out, counting all of the pollen grains. And here I am in the lab actually extracting the pollen from the soil. All right. So here you can see again some of the tools that I was using, a little bit different from your typical archaeological tools to help extract some of the pollen from thousands of years ago. And here's just a picture of a bee to remind you of what pollen looks like and where it comes from. Right. So what I was looking at, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. I'm good, right? I've got plenty of time. Okay. So what I was looking at, because I know I'm going very quickly and I want to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about. So what I looked at from my research was how people a long time ago in Ireland, that's where I was doing my research, how they used the landscape. So how were they using the land? Were they farming? Were they cutting down trees to make farmland so that they could grow crops? Were they cutting down trees to make pasture so that they could have their cows eating the grass? Or were they moving around the landscape a lot and sort of not really touching it at all? Like if you're moving around the landscape, if you don't stay in one spot for a really long time and you're not farming, you're not necessarily cutting down lots of trees. You're sort of living very lightly on the land. And so you don't leave a lot behind for archaeologists to find. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more about this. And the time period that I was looking at, I'm not going to give you too many dates because it gets confusing, but I was looking at the Iron Age in Ireland. And this is a particularly interesting time period because when archaeologists study it, there's not a lot of artifacts and there are not a lot of structures left in the landscape. There are from times before the Iron Age and there are from times after the Iron Age, but this particular period of time is just kind of, well, where did everybody go? We can't, they're not burying people in big cemeteries. We're not finding a lot of bodies. They're not living in large towns, so we're not finding lots of houses. And so there are not a lot of artifacts to look at in order to be able to study this particular period of time, the people that were living then. So I decided to look at the pollen because the pollen is preserved. We're not going to get too much into that, but just trust me on it. The pollen from thousands of years ago is preserved. And so I can look at the changes in the types of pollen that are appearing, because different types of plants have different types of pollen. And so I have one picture here that this is like pasture or farmland. You can see some cows out there. That's a bunch of grass, right? And there might be some flowers. There's a few small trees there. But the types of pollen that landscape is going to produce is going to be very different than the pollen that comes from a forest, right? Because you've got all these different trees, and those trees have their own type of pollen from all of their flowers and everything that they shed in order to reproduce. So by understanding that there are two different types of landscapes to look at, then I can understand like, oh, okay, well, we've got a lot of grass pollen. We've got a lot of other little plants that are typically eaten by cows. And so that might mean that at this point in time, they had pasture land and they were clearing the trees for it. And then it might be that at some point, oh, the tree pollen is increasing. I'm seeing more and more tree pollen. That seems like maybe they're not in this land as much. Maybe they've moved someplace else so that they're not clearing the land. The cows and other animals aren't eating the like little saplings that pop up to keep it clear of trees. The trees are actually able to grow up and get bigger. And that means that people are going someplace else. So now this is very confusing looking. Don't worry, you don't need to understand it. But this is all of my data. So what I did was I collected lots of data, I spent a lot of time at my microscope counting pollen. So counting the number of grass pollen that I found, counting the number of different tree pollen that I found, and I was able to use a method to get a date from those samples to understand how old this pollen was. And so this is a pollen diagram, and it shows over a period of time of about 1,000 years. It shows the changes in the different types of pollen that existed in a particular area over time, right? So we've got down here, this is, let's just say for ease of understanding, 1,000 years ago, really long time ago, all right? And then this is 500 years ago, okay? So we've got 500 years of history right here. And you can see all these different graphs here. And these show the different types of pollen. We've got pine, birch, ash. These are the Latin names here, but these are trees that you'd be familiar with. And then we've got hazel, and then we have grass pollen here. And so the section that I have marked out here, you can see that something like ash, okay, you see, look at it, it's going down. You can see it dips down and then it comes back up. So at some point, there was sort of a drop in ash pollen, which is a type of tree. And at the same time, if you go over here, there's an increase in the grass pollen, right? So we're seeing that at this point in time, trees are being cut down, and I'm seeing a lot more grass pollen. And so likely what the people were doing in the landscape was cutting down trees. They were living there. They were allowing their animals to graze, and that's how they were using the landscape. In another period of time, when the grass pollen goes back down and the tree pollen goes back up, they've sort of moved on. They maybe went to a different area to do the same thing, but they are no longer in that spot cutting down lots of trees. And so that was the work that I was doing, and that's just an example of some of the archaeology that can be done that is not excavating. So then, after all of that, how did I end up working for 4-H? So the research that I did, that was for getting my PhD. So I did a lot of school, doing a lot of research and everything, and I finished my graduate school, and then it came time to look for a job. And so sometimes, your plans don't go the way you expect. And I, thought I'd be teaching college students, doing research at a university. And that's not what happened. I reevaluated what it was that I really wanted to do. And I wanted to work with kids and do things like this. And I still get to talk about archaeology and my passion, like I'm doing right now, as well as a bunch of other things. And here is just a screenshot of me talking about archaeology a couple summers ago with some 4-H members and teaching them about it. And so as you're thinking about what you want to do when you grow up, keep in mind that maybe you have that goal that like, I want to be an astronaut. That's awesome. Go for it. There may be a time where you've got something in your way. Maybe you've got to go at it a little bit differently. Maybe you change your mind, or maybe you find another opportunity like working for 4-H and like that idea better than going to the moon. So I know that was a lot of information, but I hope it made sense to you, and please feel free to ask me lots of questions.
All right, so if you want to stop sharing your screen, I think we can switch to our Q&A section. All right, so we have got a lot of exciting questions. So I think I'll start with the more archaeology questions. We had a lot of questions about travel as an archaeologist. Maybe what is the furthest place you have traveled through your archaeology, and like maybe in general what other archaeologists might do as far as travel?
Yeah, so for me, I'll try to make this answer short. I did my undergraduate work, so I went to college initially in Arizona. And so some of the pictures that you saw were me doing excavations in Arizona. And then I did graduate school in Buffalo, New York, and I did some excavating there as well. And my research focused on Ireland. And so during the summers, I would go to Ireland and do excavations and data collection there. People can travel all over the place. Like usually archaeologists have a particular area that they study. So, if people don't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to do some work in Ireland, and then I'm going to go to Egypt, and then I'm going to go to China. Usually people can become experts in one particular area in the world and focus on that. And you can also do archaeology here in Maine. Like there are archaeologists here in Maine that do work as well.
Cool. We had 2 specific locations. Have you ever been to Iceland or anywhere in Scandinavia?
I have not. No, I would love to go to Iceland. I've never been there. My advisor who helped me with my graduate research also did some projects in Scandinavia, in Denmark and Sweden. She didn't do Vikings. It was later than the Viking period. But she did a lot of excavations in Scandinavia. I wasn't able to go there. And I see someone's Norwegian. I don't think she ever went to Norway, but that's another place I'd like to go.
That would be a good one. Why did you want to become an archaeologist in the first place?
That's a great question. It was something that really got me interested. Like I don't even know what it was exactly, like the exact moment, but when I was around 8 or 9 years old, something sparked my interest, and I learned what an archaeologist was, and that was it. That was what I wanted to do, and I went for it. That was straight through until I got my PhD in my 30s.
Wow.
So it was a long time. And not everyone has that same drive to follow that same path, and that's okay. I knew a lot of people who decided, when they were 25 that they wanted to be an archaeologist, and they could do that too. Yeah.
What is the coolest thing you've ever found?
See, that's a hard question. That is a really hard question, because I would say, so the coolest thing I ever found, let me see. Probably when I was working in Arizona, there were a lot of, in the particular area that I was working, there were a lot of arrowheads and a lot of painted pottery, like really nicely decorated pottery. And that was very different from when I was excavating in New York and in Ireland. And so I always look back to that and remember how neat it was to be excavating that material. And that was my first experience excavating as well. So it was very exciting.
That sounds exciting. What is the biggest hole you've ever dug?
The biggest hole. So yeah, that's a hard question too, because a lot of times it's not like we dig down, there sometimes it's out, because sometimes a lot of the material is close to the surface. So it might be big but shallow, like it might go over a long place but not be very deep, or it might be a smaller spot and it might be pretty deep. I mean, I would say a couple of meters. It's a science, so we use the metric system. So like 6 feet, maybe. That's kind of a lot, maybe 4 or 5 feet.
That's pretty big. That's as long as I am tall.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you ever see anything from space, like maybe a moon rock?
That's a good question. So that's not, if I were to find a moon rock while I was excavating, I wouldn't know it. I'd be like, oh, this is a rock, because I'm not a geologist. And sometimes we work with geologists, or sometimes other archaeologists that I'm working with also have interest in geology. And so they may know a little bit about some rocks, but something like from outer space, I think it would be surprising to find something like that. But yeah, I've I've never found anything like that.
Fair. Have you ever found any weapons other than like arrowhead tips?
I found like an axe head. So similar to in the same area where a lot of the arrowheads are being found and everything. There, I think there was like a stone axe head. And that's the only, I mean, and that isn't necessarily even a weapon. That could be just used for chopping down a tree.
Okay. Have you ever found any bones or like actual like fossilized? The example was maybe a sheep.
Right. So I just want to say the word fossil, that's something that paleontologists use, because fossil means that it's bone, something organic that has been turned to stone. And none of the stuff that archaeologists study is quite that old. So it's just bone. It's still bone. It's just been in the ground for a while. What archaeologists would typically find. I have found lots of bones from different things that people have eaten, cow bones, from like, eating cows, and, ribs and things like that people have eaten. One excavation that I was on, the one in Arizona, there were a couple of burials found. And in those instances, so there was a human skeleton. In those instances, usually you have an expert who is an expert in human bones and human remains come in and do the excavation, because they are much more familiar with each of those bones and recording them and making sure that everything is kept together.
Cool. What is your favorite place you've ever traveled to?
Favorite place I've ever traveled to? Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know. Because I've only, like, in terms of archaeology, I've only traveled to a few places specifically for archaeology. I've traveled, otherwise just, for vacations and stuff like that. I mean, I saw in the chat box that someone asked if I'd been to Greece, and I have been to Greece, and that was pretty amazing. I have to go back because I was much younger when I went, and I'd like to go back as an adult, but it was pretty cool.
Excellent. Maybe what is the hardest thing you've had to do as an archaeologist?
The hardest thing is to do graduate school. So actually, the learning part and doing that part, being in school, in graduate school, that's really challenging. Doing the research, writing a dissertation, all of that, it's a real commitment, and it takes a long time and a lot of perseverance.
Definitely. Sorry, I'm looking for what my next question is. Okay, so how did you choose your current job? Like, how did you pick 4-H? I know you said before you wanted to work with kids, but how did you pick?
So I was having some trouble finding jobs as an archaeologist in the way that I wanted to have the job. Like I talked about working at a university or something like that, and there just aren't a lot of those types of jobs available. So I thought, okay, well, I need to broaden my horizons. I need to expand my job search. What are the things that I really want to get out of a career? I want to be able to work with youth. I want to be able to do some sort of educational component, work with communities, and maybe do something where I can bring in my passion for archaeology, even if it isn't like my main job. And so I looked at a variety of different things, and I was familiar with 4-H. I knew that it existed as an organization, and there happened to be a position open here in Maine, and it just fit really well with what I wanted to do, and I've been really happy here.
How does archaeology play into your work at 4-H?
So, like I said, I get to do things like this. I do a lot of different things with 4-H. You know, we have the fair. A lot of 4-H clubs have kids who show livestock. We have the exhibit hall. We have different activities throughout the year that a variety of things. It can be robotics. It can be arts and crafts, you know, all sorts of different things, public speaking. And so I help do all of those things, but then I also do something like this. Or during the summer, we have a virtual learning series where we do, me and some of my colleagues do Zoom workshops, and I have done workshops on archaeology, like talking about archaeology and doing some sort of pretend artifact analysis with kids. So I get to pull in my interest in archaeology by sort of teaching it and exposing kids to archaeology, even if I'm not actively doing research.
Excellent. Have you ever found any forms of money?
That is a tricky question to answer, because you say forms of money, and I'm glad you said it like that, because you know, we think of coins and dollar bills as being money, but that's, you know, people had different objects that were of value that could have been traded, that may not have been what we would consider money. So arrowheads made of specific type of stone could actually be traded, not necessarily as money, but they would be a valuable object that someone might trade for something else. So in that sense, you could say that I have found some type of money. I will say I've probably found like some old pennies, like that fell out of someone's pocket like 50 years ago or something, like, you know, and worked its way down into the soil, but nothing like an old Roman coin or anything like that.
Okay. What is the oldest thing you've ever found?
I would say, so again, going back to when I was excavating in Arizona, I don't remember the exact dates, but a lot of the things that I was finding were probably about 3,000 to 5,000 years old. But I can't give you an exact date on that.
That's pretty old.
Pretty old, yeah.
We have another question. If you have possibly dug up anything that might have belonged to a ninja.
Well, I think ninjas come from a particular part of the world. I think that practice of being in what we call a ninja is more in Asia, I think. And I have not excavated there at all. So no, I have not. Also, they're very sneaky, so who knows? Maybe I have, but I wouldn't know.
How do you determine how old something is? That's a good question.
That's a really good question too. So there's something called radiocarbon dating, and it is looking at type of chemical signature that living things have. And once that living thing dies, a certain amount of that chemical signature dies as well, and it dies at a rate that we can, I don't want to get it too confusing, but basically anything that was once living, so not a rock, but like, or a piece of pottery, but like any bones or seeds or anything that was maybe burned, like a piece of wood that was preserved in the past, we can date that through this chemical process and learn how old it is. With things like pottery and arrowheads, we can date them, like if we've dated something like, oh, we found this piece of pottery with a piece of wood in it and we were able to date the wood, we can say, oh, well, then this piece of pottery is probably that old as well. And then once we have enough dates, we can say like, oh, well, there's a certain style of pottery that exists during this period of time, or there's a certain style of arrowhead that was made during this time period. And so you can think about like fashion, from the 70s and all the different types of fashion that existed then. And when you see someone dressed in it, it's like, oh, why are they dressed like it's the 1970s? So it's a stylistic way of being able to date something.
Well, that actually brings me to one of our questions. Have you ever found any clothing?
No. But Ireland is actually a good place to find clothing or materials like that would preserve really well. So things like fabric don't preserve very well. They break down very easily. You get holes in your clothes very easily. So it's something that, is in the ground. It's not going to last very long. But there are certain types of environments where things like that preserve really well. So in anaerobic environments, someplace where it's really, really wet, like in a bog in Ireland, things like wood and clothing could potentially preserve, and leather, or really, really, really dry places like Egypt in the desert. Some clothing and things like that can preserve really well too. I have not, in the places where I've excavated, it would be very unusual to find something like that.
Okay. Have you ever found any kind of writing?
Kind of writing. Yes, technically. So, though it's not very exciting. Some of the excavations that I did in Ireland it wasn't thousands of years ago, it was maybe hundreds of years ago. And so there's, we'd find broken dishes and things, and there'd be, if you look at your plates and cups that you have at home, if they're made of, ceramic like that, or like fine china, on the bottom, there's usually like, it says where it was made or what the brand is. And so I've found pieces of pottery like that. Like if any of you live in an old farmhouse, I bet you could find some in the ground somewhere in your backyard. There's lots of it.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we are kind of running a little lower on time. So I want to transition into our final two questions that I ask now. What is your absolute favorite part of your job?
So my absolute favorite part of my job as 4-H, working with 4-H, is doing things like this. I really enjoy sharing my passions, and just anything where I get to work with young people and answer their questions and help them explore things that they're interested in. That makes me feel really good, and I enjoy doing that.
Absolutely. So last question is, what are you most excited about in the field right now? So this could either be in 4-H or in archaeology or both.
Right. So what am I most excited about in the field right now? So I'm going to stick to 4-H since that's what I'm like most currently in. I am excited about this upcoming year, I'll say. And just, 4-H has changed a lot, as a lot of things have changed since COVID, and we're sort of looking at how we do programs and doing a lot of virtual programs, and just what the needs are of the youth that we work with. And so I'm looking forward to this coming year and figuring out better ways of reaching lots of kids in York County, and how I can do that. And it'll be different from the last couple of years that I've been in this job.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.